Frigid waters, strong currents, deadly fog. These things made Alcatraz one of the most difficult and dangerous prisons to escape from in the world. But these were not the only obstacles that cost escapees their lives. The geography of San Francisco Bay has momentum-killing eddies and jagged rock formations carved from millions of years of erosion. Alcatraz was literally built to be a fortress. It was later turned into a prison because the surrounding waters and geologic features formed natural obstacles that kept prisoners contained. Join us as we explore the deadly geography of Alcatraz Island. Alcatraz, also known as the Rock, sits approximately 1.25 miles or 2 kilometers away from the mainland of California. The island is around 22 acres or 9 hectares in size. To its south is San Francisco. To the east are Treasure Island and Oakland. However, for any inmates looking to escape Alcatraz, it was the feature to the west that posed the biggest danger. Here, the Golden Gate Strait opens up the San Francisco Bay into the Pacific Ocean. It is this narrow passage that causes many of the deadly natural features around Alcatraz. Let's go back in time to understand why the island is the way it is. Before any structures were built, Alcatraz was covered in rocky soil, hardy shrubs, and a plethora of seabirds. The island sits between the San Andreas and Hayward Faults, which are located at the boundary of the Pacific and North American tectonic plates. These geologic features make the area prone to severe earthquakes, such as the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that cost the lives of 3,000 individuals and registered a 7.9 on the Richter scale. However, because of how Alcatraz was formed, it acts as a relative safe haven during the geologic events. It is almost completely solid rock, with very little sediment and anchored to the bedrock of the bay floor, which reduces the amount of seismic stress imposed on the island. Alcatraz was created around 100 million years ago when the Farallon Plate, which no longer exists, was pushed under the North American Plate at a subduction zone. This process led to the rising of the North American Plate, creating mountains along the fault line. Alcatraz was one of these mountains. Now let's examine 3 specific reasons why the geography and geology of Alcatraz Island made it so difficult for prisoners to escape. 1. The island's features. The cliffs of Alcatraz reach a height of 50 feet or 15.25 meters. There are small beaches, inlets, and caves that have been carved out of the island by waves and intense winds, but for the most part, Alcatraz is nothing but sheer sandstone. Even in the best of circumstances, the natural rock walls of the island are difficult to navigate. For an inmate trying to make a quick escape from the island, it was nearly impossible to reach the water without sustaining a serious injury. As previously mentioned, Alcatraz is only located about 1.25 miles or 2 kilometers from the piers and wharves of San Francisco, but due to the currents and several other geographic factors that will be discussed soon, a straight shot from Alcatraz to the mainland isn't exactly possible without a motor-powered boat. The island is isolated from land in all directions. From Alcatraz to Treasure Island, it's approximately 2.25 miles or roughly 3.6 kilometers. From Alcatraz to Angel Island, it's about 1.7 miles or 2.75 kilometers, and then another 3,100 feet or 966 meters to the mainland once on the other side. The Golden Gate Bridge is just under 3 miles or 4.8 kilometers from the Rock, so no matter which way an escapee swam, there was no land within close proximity. The natural features of Alcatraz Island made it a fortress, which is exactly what it was first used for. This meant that the prison to come would be built on the foundations of an actual fort. Alcatraz is the peak of an underwater mountain that is isolated from every other piece of land in the San Francisco Bay by over a mile of water. Prisoners on the Rock would be able to see the mainland, but reaching it would be nothing short of an unobtainable dream. 2. The water. Although the island's steep cliffs and jagged rocks make it extremely difficult to reach the shoreline, the waters surrounding Alcatraz are the most deadly natural defense it has to stop prisoners from escaping. The currents that rush past Alcatraz are a death sentence for even the strongest swimmers. Approximately 40% of the water from Northern California drains into the San Francisco Bay. All of that flowing water is eventually pulled into the Pacific Ocean through the Golden Gate Strait, which is approximately 1.1 miles or 1.8 kilometers at its shortest width and has a maximum depth of 377 feet or 115 meters. The San Francisco Bay is roughly 60 miles or 97 kilometers long and between 3 to 12 miles or 5 to 19 kilometers wide. What this means is that a massive amount of water flows through the relatively narrow passage of the Golden Gate Strait at all times as the bay empties out into the ocean. This is one of the reasons that the currents around Alcatraz are so strong. The bay is between 1,600 square miles or 4,000 kilometers if all of the sub-bay's estuaries and wetlands are included, which makes it the largest Pacific estuary in both North and South America. The massive water system that surrounds Alcatraz has currents strong enough to pick up sediment from within the bay and deposit it on the ocean floor just past the Golden Gate Strait to create sand wave features that are 3 stories high. An estimated 2 trillion liters or 530 billion gallons of water flows through the Golden Gate Strait during every tide cycle. This creates a water flow 160 times greater than the volume of water cascading down Niagara Falls during the same amount of time. What all of these geologic and hydrologic factors signify is that the water flowing past Alcatraz towards the Pacific Ocean is moving at around 5 to 7 knots, which is around 5 3/4 to 8 miles an hour or 9.3 to 12.9 kilometers per hour. The average human can swim around 2 miles an hour or 3.2 kilometers an hour, meaning that no one on Earth can overcome the current running past Alcatraz when it is at its most intense. For inmates on the island who wanted to escape the clutches of prison and decide to make a swim for it, the current could drag them out to sea in an hour to an hour and a half. And even if they could somehow construct a raft, which one group did, there are eddies throughout the channel that would hinder their escape. An eddy is basically a small tidal whirlpool where the water is moving in a circle. This causes a loss in momentum in these regions, which might not be a good thing if your goal is to use the current to paddle away from Alcatraz. It is possible for a raft to become stuck in the eddies as the exhausted paddlers run out of the strength needed to move their craft back into the current before being captured and returned to the prison. Even worse for an escapee is the fact that some of the currents actually flow back toward Alcatraz. This means that an inmate trying to swim for shore might get part of the way there and then find himself pulled back to the rock and the very prison he was trying to escape. At least one inmate's dead body washed back onto Alcatraz Island after an attempted escape while the prison was still in operation. The water and its currents are the most dangerous obstacle an inmate trying to escape Alcatraz would face. However, these things are by no means the most frightening. There are predators that lurk in the depths of the San Francisco Bay. In 1959, a great white shark attacked and killed a college student in the bay. Then in 2015, another great white was caught on camera breaching the waters off the shore of Alcatraz as it clamped its jaws shut on a seal swimming nearby. So, on top of deadly currents, anyone trying to escape Alcatraz would run the risk of being attacked by the apex predator of the oceans. 3. Weather. The air temperature around Alcatraz varies throughout the year. Between June and October, the average temperature is 69 degrees Fahrenheit or 20.6 degrees Celsius. However, the temperature can fluctuate from anywhere between 72 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, or 22 to 14 degrees Celsius during this time. In the cooler months of December through February, the average temperature can dip as low as 46 degrees Fahrenheit or 7.8 degrees Celsius. The low temperatures mean that an escapee coming out of the frigid waters of the San Francisco Bay would need to immediately find shelter and a way to warm up to keep his body from going into hypothermia. However, the air temperature is only part of the problem. The water temperature around Alcatraz is so cold that it would shock the escaped inmate's body, and if he ventured out into the bay at the wrong time of the year, hypothermia could set in long before he made it anywhere near the shore. The water temperature around Alcatraz rarely gets above 56 degrees Fahrenheit or 13 degrees Celsius. This means that at any point of the year, an inmate's body could go hypothermic after only a couple of hours in the water. However, from January to June, the water temperature usually doesn't get above 53 degrees Fahrenheit or 12 degrees Celsius, meaning hypothermia could set in within an hour. The cold water in the bay is caused by the upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich water from the bottom of the ocean being circulated to the surface. The differing temperatures between the water and the air cause another deadly obstacle that inmates need to overcome if they have any hope of escaping Alcatraz. When the warmer air and the cooler surface water come into contact, condensation occurs. This causes fog. But the fog around Alcatraz Island and San Francisco Bay is not just a light mist, it is all-consuming. When the fog rolls into the bay, it completely blocks out any view of the mainland from Alcatraz. During these times, there would be no way for an escapee to know which direction to swim or paddle to reach safety. Under these conditions, it would be much more likely that the person would be swept out to sea long before they could reach land. The fog around Alcatraz can be so bad that it's led to a number of shipwrecks in the area. In fact, at least 24 sunken ships have been located on the floor of San Francisco Bay. It's estimated that the actual number of shipwrecks in the region is much higher at around 100, and some researchers hypothesize there could be at least 300 lost ships in the area. Many of these tragedies were caused by foggy weather conditions and intense currents. Before we dive into several escape attempts from Alcatraz by inmates, we need to examine the history of the island and how it became home to the most notorious and feared prison in the country. It is worth noting that while in operation, no one is confirmed to have successfully escaped the island and lived to tell about it. However, there are 3 inmates who we know made it into the waters of San Francisco Bay, but their bodies have never been found. We'll examine how these men managed to get out of the prison and reach the water later on. However, the chances that they actually made it to the shore alive are slim to none. Alcatraz Island's history begins long before European settlers traveled to the Pacific coast of North America. During the last ice age, prior to 11,000 years ago, what is now San Francisco Bay was a valley with a series of hills and rivers running through it. Over the next few thousand years, the Earth's temperature began to rise. By around 7,000 years ago, the ice sheets and glaciers had melted, dumping huge amounts of water into the oceans. This caused sea levels to rise by around 300 feet or 90 meters. The ocean water poured into the valley, creating what would become the San Francisco Bay. However, the peak of a few mountains still remained above water, one of which was Alcatraz Island. Before the flooding event, humans had migrated from Asia to the Americas. Some followed the ice sheets and shores along the coast and made their way further and further south. Others crossed the Bering Land Bridge that existed between Siberia and Alaska, following the migration of big game such as the woolly mammoth. Before European conquest, approximately 10,000 indigenous people belonging to the Ohlone tribe lived in the area around what would later be named San Francisco Bay. Based on oral histories along with archaeological and ethnic data collected from the region, it is believed that the indigenous people used Alcatraz Island as a place of isolation. It is theorized that tribe members or enemies who broke the tribal norms were banished to the island as punishment. The island was also used for its resources, such as bird eggs and the sea life along its shores. When Europeans arrived, Alcatraz Island was used as a hiding place for many indigenous people as they tried to escape the brutal campaign to eradicate their culture and assimilate them into the European way of life. And this would not be the last time that indigenous peoples used the island as a refuge. In 1775, Spanish Lieutenant Juan Manuel de Ayala surveyed the San Francisco Bay Area and created the first European map of the region. On it, he labeled an island about 1¼ miles off the main shore as Isla de los Alcatraces, or Isle of the Pelicans. This would later become Alcatraz. On February 2, 1848, the Mexican leadership signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to end the Guerra de 1847, also known as the Mexican-American War. The agreement stated that Mexico would cede 55% of its territory to the United States, including the land that would become California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. This meant that the United States was now also in control of Alcatraz Island. In 1853, the U.S. military turned Alcatraz into a fortress to protect the harbor from any and all aggressors. The following year, in 1854, the Alcatraz Lighthouse was completed and became the first lighthouse on the Pacific coast. In the following months, Captain Joseph Stewart and 86 men of Company H, 3rd U.S. Artillery were stationed on Alcatraz. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Alcatraz became the stronghold protecting San Francisco from rebel attacks against the pro-Union northern section of California. 2 years after the war started, a temporary wooden structure was built on the island that served as the first prison at Alcatraz. The structure was expanded and became the first Civil War bastion and the first official army prison known as Uncle Sam's Devil's Island as well. In 1895, 19 members of the Hopi tribe were shipped off to Alcatraz for resisting the forced cultural assimilation programs conducted under the veil of what the U.S. called federal boarding schools. As a result of overcrowding during the Spanish-American War, the upper prison was built on the island. In 1912, the third prison, which is the structure that still stands today, was constructed using inmate labor. Those same prisoners then moved into the structure they had just helped make. Then in 1933, Alcatraz was transferred from the military to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and 32 of the most feared and dangerous convicts were sent to the island for its reputation of being inescapable. In August of 1934, the prison structures on the island were modernized and fortified. This would lead to many officials declaring that Alcatraz was the strongest prison in the United States. For the next several years, high-profile criminals were continuously sent to Alcatraz, including Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Robert Stroud, also known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, and James Whitey Bulger. Even though the prison could hold up to 450 convicts, it was rare that there were more than 250 inmates housed at the facility at any given time. They lived in 10 by 4.5 foot or 3 by 1.5 meter cells, which they were only allowed out of to conduct their assigned tasks for the day. By the 1950s, it became apparent that running and maintaining the remote prison on Alcatraz Island was becoming costly. In 1959, a report concluded that Alcatraz cost 3 times more to operate than a comparable prison on the mainland. It cost $10 per prisoner per day to keep the facility running on Alcatraz, while it only cost $3 per prisoner per day in other prisons. This led to discussions about the long-term viability of Alcatraz. The same geographic features that made the prison impossible to escape also made it expensive to maintain. The continuous exposure to salt spray caused the structures on the island to decay. The strong currents and heavy fog made shipping supplies to Alcatraz difficult during certain times of the year. Engineers determined that all of the damage sustained during its decades of operation would cost $5 million to repair. On March 21, 1963, Alcatraz prison officially closed. But that was not the end of the story for the island. One of the least well-known events in Alcatraz's history happened in the 1960s after the prison closed, and it goes to show just how isolating it could be. In 1964, Richard Mackenzie and his wife, Belva Cottier, led a group of 5 Siangu Lakota Indians to occupy Alcatraz Island. The Federal Bureau of Prisons no longer used the island, and the U.S. government hadn't found another use for it. The group of Indian Americans cited an 1868 treaty with the Sioux that stated that Indians from the reservation could claim any unoccupied government land. Technically, since Alcatraz had been decommissioned and abandoned the previous year, the island was unoccupied government land. The United States government showed no interest in the island until the 5 Sicangu Lakota Indians tried to reclaim it. The group of occupiers was escorted off Alcatraz Island several hours after the occupation began. On November 9, 1969, Richard Oakes, a member of the Mohawk Nation, led a group of Indian supporters to occupy Alcatraz once again, since the government still had no plans for the island. 11 days later, things escalated, and a full-blown occupation of Alcatraz commenced. The occupation would last 19 months and end on June 11, 1971. During this time, 80 Indian students from UCLA and an additional 20 other Indian people lived on the island. A council was elected to oversee the day-to-day operations, which include daycare, education, security, and cooking. The community on Alcatraz became self-sufficient by growing their own food, which meant they didn't have to continuously cross the dangerous waters around Alcatraz for supplies, and the blockade the US government enacted to try and force the occupiers off the island was useless. When 2 oil tankers collided in January of 1971, the government blamed the occupants of the island for the lighthouse and foghorn not working, since US officials decided to turn the power to the island off to force the occupants to leave. It was later acknowledged that the Alcatraz light and foghorn would not have prevented the collision regardless. After the incident, President Nixon approved a removal plan. On June 10th, fully armed marshals, FBI agents, and Special Forces police landed on Alcatraz and removed all of the remaining occupiers. The goal of the occupation was to raise awareness of the plight of the first Americans and advocate for Indian self-determination, which it successfully did. To keep another occupation from happening, the United States government designated Alcatraz a part of the newly created Golden Gate National Recreation Area. By doing so, it was no longer unused government land, although no work was done to repair the damaged structures on the island. Alcatraz Island became a National Historical Park in 1973. Now, let's go back and look at what happened to the inmates who tried to escape Alcatraz. There were no happy endings for these convicts, and as of right now, official records state that no one has ever successfully escaped the Rock. The facility had 1 officer for every 3 inmates, which was much higher than any other prison at the time. The inmates would be counted 12 times a day to make sure no one had attempted to escape or was hiding. To keep the prisoners in line, brutal tactics and corporal punishment were implemented. But perhaps the most disheartening aspect of Alcatraz for the prisoners was that they could see the San Francisco skyline from the island. It was a constant reminder that they were trapped without any real hope of escape. The very first escape attempt was made on April 27, 1936. Joseph Bowers was working the incinerator shift, burning trash from the facility, when he made a run for a chain-link fence at the edge of the island. He tried to scale it, but the guards spotted him and ordered the convict to halt. Bowers refused and was shot. He fell over 50 feet or 15 meters to the ground and died. He did not get very far, but it showed that prisoners were willing to risk their lives to get off the rock, even though escaping the prison walls was the easy part. The cold waters of San Francisco Bay were the real obstacle, which several escapees would find out in the coming years. 4 other escape attempts by inmates were met with similar fates as Bowers. The guards fired and killed the prisoners or recaptured them with each attempt. Then, on April 14, 1943, James Borman, Harold Martin Brest, Floyd Garland Hamilton, and Fred John Hunter escaped through a window they had cut the bars off of in the Industries building. They knocked out 2 guards and tied them up. However, one of the guards awoke and managed to blow his whistle. The tower guards were alerted of the escape and spotted the fleeing prisoners. They opened fire at the men. Borman was struck by a bullet and fell into the water. He bobbed up and down in the dark waves of the San Francisco Bay. Brest managed to swim to him and held him above water, but as the guards boarded a boat and steered towards Brest, he dropped Borman, who sank to the bottom of the bay. Brest was hauled on board the boat and brought back to Alcatraz. Hunter had been injured while trying to traverse the sharp rocks along one of the cliffs of the island. As he entered the water and started to swim, Hunter realized he would never make it to shore. He took refuge in a cave on Alcatraz Island, but was discovered by the guards 2 hours later when they followed his trail of blood to the cave entrance. Hamilton tried to swim away too, but like Hunter, he decided he wouldn't get very far. He was found the morning after Hunter. This escape attempt just reaffirmed that escaping Alcatraz and surviving the swim to shore was a near impossible task. On May 2nd, a group of men launched the most violent escape attempt during Alcatraz's time in operation. 6 prisoners by the names of Bernard Coy, Joseph Kretzer, Sam Shockley, Clarence Carnes, Marvin Hubbard, and Myron Thompson coordinated with one another to overwhelm the guards in their cell house. They stole the keys from one of the correctional officers and made their way to the weapons room. The inmates made their way to the outside door but didn't have the correct key to open it, so instead, they took the 2 guards as hostages to try and negotiate their way to freedom. When it became clear that reinforcements had arrived and that there was little chance of escape, the 2 hostages were shot at close range by Kretzer. Shockley, Thompson, and Carnes had lost hope and returned to their cells after the murders. However, Coy, Kretzer, and Hubbard were not ready to give up just yet. U.S. Marines landed on Alcatraz Island and entered the cell block with the guards. In the ensuing firefight, 17 guards were killed, along with 1 prisoner who was in his cell. Coy, Kretzer, and Hubbard were all killed. The final escape attempt at Alcatraz was made by John Paul Scott and Darrell Lee Parker on December 16, 1962. These 2 inmates made a makeshift saw, which they used to cut through a set of bars on a kitchen window. They proceeded along the edge of the island and jumped into the icy waters surrounding Alcatraz. Parker made it to a small rock outcropping called Little Alcatraz, about 150 feet or 46 meters away from the main island. The guards found him waving and shouting at them to come to his rescue. The cold water and strong current were too much for Parker, so he gave up before the San Francisco Bay could take his life. However, John Paul Scott kept swimming. The current carried him into the Golden Gate Strait and towards the ocean. He managed to keep moving diagonally through the current and made it to Fort Point, under the Golden Gate Bridge. He was shaking uncontrollably, suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion when he was discovered by a group of teenagers. The teenagers flagged down the guards searching for Scott in a boat nearby, and they took him to Letterman General Hospital before returning him to Alcatraz. For a brief few minutes, Scott became the only person to escape Alcatraz and all of its geographic obstacles and make it to the mainland. Unfortunately for him, he was too cold and tired to enjoy his short stint of freedom. The most famous escape attempt made by inmates at Alcatraz was carried out by Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin on June 11, 1962. The 3 men meticulously dug holes in each of their cells in Block B to gain access to a 3-foot or 0.9-meter wide utility corridor behind the wall. They used a vacuum cleaner motor and a stolen drill bit, spoons, and forks to break through the walls next to their beds. They conducted their operation during music hour to hide the sounds of the drill from the guard. When they weren't working, they put up false walls to cover their holes. They also constructed dummies complete with realistic-looking heads made of plaster and papier-mâché and covered them with human hair. The 3 convicts acquired over 50 rubber rain jackets from their fellow inmates, which they later used to make a raft. Morris and the Anglin brothers are believed to have boarded their makeshift raft and paddled into the turbulent waters of the San Francisco Bay the night of the 11th. The currents that evening were particularly strong, and the water was a bone-chilling 52 degrees Fahrenheit or 11 degrees Celsius. The official FBI records conclude that the men never made it to shore, and their dead bodies were dragged out to sea. A number of rain jackets from the raft and life preservers have been found over the years, associated with the infamous escape from Alcatraz, but no one knows if the 3 men ever made it to shore or if they were consumed by the water surrounding Alcatraz. As of this moment in time, most evidence suggests that Morris and the Anglin brothers perished during their escape from Alcatraz. It is hard to believe that the men safely made it to shore when considering the natural geography of Alcatraz and the surrounding area. The island is over a mile from the mainland. The currents around Alcatraz make swimming or maneuvering a raft nearly impossible, and the frigid water is cold enough to cause hypothermia in a matter of hours. The weather, geology, and geography of Alcatraz made it one of the most feared prisons of its time, and it is for these reasons that there has never officially been a successful escape. Now watch, what is the safest place on Earth? Or check out this other video you might like.